It began as an ordinary dawn, but the world soon realized something was terribly wrong. The first light of the morning carried no warmth, no brilliance. The sun, once a faithful golden companion, rose behind a shroud of gray that refused to lift. Its face was pale and distant, like a dying ember behind a curtain of smoke. Farmers across Europe looked up in disbelief. In Constantinople, monks recorded that the sun gave no light like the moon for nearly a whole year. The world had entered a strange, cold twilight, and no one could explain why. The days felt shorter, though time itself had not changed. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air grew heavy with silence. Birds abandoned their songs. The colors of the world, green fields, blue skies, the crimson of dawn, faded into a dull spectrum of ash. Even at noon, when the sun should have burned brightly, its light felt thin and sickly. People could stare at it without squinting, and that frightened them. It was as though the heavens had lost their fire. The year was 536 AD, and from the far reaches of Europe to the distant edges of Asia, the same unsettling truth spread: the light was dying. In Ireland, the chroniclers wrote of a failure of bread. In China, strange fogs rolled across entire provinces. In Syria and the Mediterranean, priests held vigils, pleading with God to restore the sun. The earth, it seemed, had fallen under a spell. At first, people waited, expecting the haze to pass. But as weeks turned to months, unease hardened into fear. The air itself began to taste of dust, fine, bitter particles that coated lips and lingered on the tongue. It clung to the skin and dimmed the stars at night. The moon rose as a faint disk of red, like an ember glowing behind smoke. The familiar constellations, those ancient companions of sailors and wanderers, disappeared from the sky. Crops began to fail. Seeds sprouted weakly, their stems thin and brittle, their leaves gray instead of green. Cattle grew thin from lack of fodder. Rivers slowed, carrying strange films of soot along their surface. The once vibrant rhythm of nature seemed to falter, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. For the first time in generations, the people of the ancient world felt small before something vast and unseen. Kings consulted priests. Scholars debated omens. Some said the gods were angry, others whispered of demons that devoured the sun. In the Byzantine capital, Emperor Justinian ordered prayers throughout the empire, his voice echoing through churches lit by dim, flickering candles. In the marketplaces of Rome's crumbling descendants, merchants sold charms and relics said to ward off celestial wrath. The darkness carried a strange stillness, an unsettling quiet that stretched over cities and fields alike. When the wind rose, it brought no freshness, only a chill that bit through even the thickest cloaks. Fires burned strangely, their flames blue and uncertain, as if the very air had turned against them. Nights grew longer and colder, and yet even during the day, people lit lamps to see their work. Time itself seemed to dissolve. Without the sun's steady rhythm, days bled into nights. People awoke unsure if it was morning or dusk. Crops could no longer be trusted to ripen. The world's great empires, Byzantine, Sasanian, Chinese, each stood beneath the same ghostly sky, all equally powerless before this new reality. In distant monasteries, scribes began to record what they witnessed. Their words would later echo across centuries. The sun was without brightness for 18 months. Another wrote, "We marveled, for neither shadow nor warmth came from it." To later historians, these fragments would become clues. To the people of 536 AD, they were laments, a chorus of fear in an age suddenly without light. And yet, there was also awe. The world had become dreamlike, suspended between night and day. Travelers described the land as if seen through smoke. Forests turned silent, oceans mirrored the gray above, and mountains stood like ghosts on the horizon. It was beautiful in a terrible way, an earth transformed into a vast, muted painting. Children born in that year would never forget the sight of the sunless sky. To them, this dim world was normal, the way things had always been. But the elders, who remembered golden summers and the warmth of real daylight, carried sorrow in their hearts. They spoke softly of the old world, the one that had vanished behind the veil. And so, humanity waited, through the cold mornings and the gray afternoons, through nights when even the moon refused to shine. No one knew whether the light would ever return. The world stood at the edge of something vast and unknowable, a silence deep enough to feel divine. Somewhere, perhaps high in the northern seas or deep within a mountain's heart, the earth had stirred, and the sky had answered. The year 536 AD would be remembered by scholars as the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in recorded history. But for those who lived it, it was not history, it was life itself. A world dimmed, a sun in mourning, and a quiet, uneasy sense that the end of all things might already have begun. Word of the dimmed sun spread like rumor carried on the wind, crossing mountains and seas, whispered in markets and temples alike. In villages across Europe, people gathered at dawn to see if the light had returned, only to find the same lifeless sky staring back at them. The sun hung pale and distant, its warmth stolen, its brilliance lost. Every morning brought new stories, of strange fogs, dying fields, and skies that seemed to breathe dust. What began as confusion soon turned to dread. The heavens had gone silent, and mankind, once confident beneath its light, now trembled beneath its shadow. In Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine world, the great city awoke each day under a veil of gray. Sailors on the Bosporus swore the horizon had vanished into mist. The priests in Hagia Sophia prayed before the dim altar flame, their chants echoing off the marble as if seeking a god who no longer heard them. Emperor Justinian's scholars tried to explain the haze. Some said it was smoke from distant fires. Others believed the sun had grown ill, wounded by celestial war or divine wrath. Yet no explanation satisfied the people, for the darkness would not fade. In the marketplaces, whispers grew. Some said the world had entered its final days, that angels were weeping in the clouds. Others recalled prophecies of a son devoured by a beast, a sign that the end was near. Old stories returned to life. In Norse lands, they spoke of Fenrir, the wolf destined to swallow the sun. In Persia, astrologers scanned the dim heavens for omens of kings' deaths and empires' fall. Every culture, every faith, searched for meaning in a sky that refused to answer. Far to the east, in the courts of the Northern Wei dynasty, Chinese scholars recorded a yellow fog that dimmed the sun and chilled the earth. Frost fell in midsummer. The emperor ordered fires lit across the capital, but the warmth seemed to vanish as quickly as it was born. Farmers wrote of wheat that would not ripen, of rivers running low and fish dying where the water had once been clear. The natural order, the steady cycle of planting, harvest, and rest, was breaking apart before their eyes. In the monasteries of Ireland, monks inked careful lines into parchment, noting that a failure of bread had begun. The words were simple, but behind them lay hunger, despair, and disbelief. Villages faced the first true famines in living memory. The thin sunlight gave no nourishment, and cold rains soaked the soil before it could bear fruit. Families burned through their stores of grain, watching the next season's hope vanish into the mist. Travelers who moved between kingdoms carried stories darker than the skies themselves. They told of flocks falling from the air, of livestock dying without cause, of entire regions covered in fog so thick that ships could not find the shore. Along the Silk Road, caravans arrived weeks late, their camels gaunt and their faces marked by wind and ash. They brought tales from Persia, from India, from the far reaches of China, all repeating the same strange refrain: the sun no longer shone as it once had. And still, humanity sought reasons. Some philosophers argued the heavens were purging themselves, that the stars had aligned to bring judgment upon the earth. Others believed the gods had withdrawn their favor entirely, leaving humankind to wander in spiritual exile. In the marketplaces of Alexandria, people pointed to the sky and swore they could see shapes moving within the haze, vast, silent forms, like spirits adrift in the mist. The imagination, deprived of light, began to fill the void with fear. By late summer, the once rich lands of the Mediterranean began to fail. Olive trees bore shriveled fruit, vineyards produced thin, bitter wine. In northern lands, wheat stalks barely rose from the ground. Even in Egypt, where the Nile's floods once promised abundance, harvests grew small and uncertain. The darkness had become a global shadow, stretching from one empire to the next, a common thread binding all nations in helpless wonder. At night, the stars refused to shine clearly. The Milky Way faded to a dim blur. Sailors, who once guided their ships by constellations, now found themselves lost at sea. The moon glowed red, sometimes disappearing entirely behind veils of dust. To the ancient mind, it was as though the heavens themselves were dying. People wept openly during eclipses, fearing the sun and moon had gone to war. In the absence of answers, stories grew powerful. In the valleys of the Alps, shepherds told of mountains breathing smoke, of fire hidden beneath the snow. In the distant steppes, nomads spoke of dragons stirring beneath the earth, shaking loose the dust that now smothered the sky. Legends became explanations, and explanations became belief. Fear united all tongues. Weeks turned to months, and the whispers became laments. The color of life seemed drained away. Green turned gray, blue became silver, gold dulled to ash. The world's pulse slowed. Children who had once laughed in open fields now stayed indoors by candlelight. Priests spoke in hushed tones of patience, of faith being tested, but even their voices carried uncertainty. The faithful knelt before the dim altars, asking the same silent question: when will the sun return? Yet amidst despair, there was also a strange kind of stillness, an uneasy beauty in the muted light. Travelers described landscapes bathed in eternal dusk, rivers reflecting silver skies, forests glowing faintly as if caught between dream and memory. Painters, centuries later, would try to imagine such a scene, but no art could truly capture the feeling of living within it. It was neither night nor day, neither hope nor despair, only the endless, haunting twilight of 536 AD. Those who lived through it would never forget. For them, the year the sun grew pale was not merely an event, it was a wound-upon time itself. They did not yet know that something immense had happened far beyond their sight, something in the deep heart of the earth or the far reaches of the sea. But they could feel it in the air, in the soil, in their bones. The world was whispering, and though its message was not yet clear, it spoke of change. Something vast and ancient had stirred, and humanity, for all its empires and prayers, could only watch the dim horizon and wait. As the months stretched on, the mystery of the dying light deepened. The dim sun still hung above the horizon, pale and lifeless, casting no shadow and giving no warmth. The air carried a faint, bitter tang, and even the rain that fell seemed tainted, darker, heavier, leaving a fine layer of soot upon rooftops and leaves. People across the world began to wonder whether this was truly the end of days, or something far more earthly, yet just as terrifying. In truth, though they could not have known it, the cause of their suffering was neither divine wrath nor celestial curse, but the earth itself, awakening in violence. Somewhere, far from any living eye, a mountain had erupted with a force beyond imagining. It might have been in Iceland, where fire sleeps beneath glaciers, or perhaps in the distant jungles of Central America, where ancient volcanoes brewed in silence. Modern science would one day reveal the traces: fine volcanic glass buried deep in ice cores, and ash particles found in tree rings around the world. But in 536 AD, there were no instruments to measure the sky, no satellites to see the plume rising into the stratosphere. All people could see was the aftermath: a sun that no longer shone, a sky that no longer breathed. The eruption must have been colossal, one of the largest in recorded history. It sent vast columns of ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere, spreading like a veil across the entire planet. The Earth's sunlight, once a faithful constant, was scattered and absorbed by that dense veil. The blue of the sky turned to gray, the golden light of day dulled to silver. The global temperature dropped, and the very rhythm of life faltered. The world was, in effect, plunged into a volcanic winter. From the icy north to the warm heart of the Mediterranean, the signs were the same. Crops withered, rivers chilled, and the once gentle rains turned cold and relentless. Entire ecosystems began to collapse. In the forests of Europe, trees grew rings so thin they were barely visible, a living record of the sun's failure. In the highlands of Asia, farmers abandoned their terraces, unable to coax life from the barren soil. Fish migrated in confusion as oceans cooled. The planet itself seemed to mourn. Those who lived through it found themselves trapped between faith and fear. Priests in the Byzantine Empire called for repentance, urging the people to cleanse their souls before the coming judgment. In the deserts of Arabia, travelers spoke of the sky weeping dust, its tears staining the dunes. The Persians believed a cosmic struggle had begun, light and darkness locked in battle. To the Norse, it was Fimbulwinter, the great cold before the world's end. Myth and faith wrapped themselves around the catastrophe, giving shape to what could not yet be understood. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of burnt stone. When the wind shifted, it carried fine ash across continents. It fell softly, like gray snow, settling on the rooftops of Constantinople, on the temples of India, on the icy fjords of Scandinavia. People swept it from their doorsteps without knowing they were touching the breath of a volcano that had shaken the earth to its core. For those who stood beneath its unseen shadow, it felt as though the world itself was fading, color, sound, warmth, all dissolving into a long, gray silence. Centuries later, scientists would reconstruct the evidence with careful precision. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica would show a sudden spike in sulfur deposits in the year 536. Tree rings across Europe and Asia would reveal that growth nearly stopped for over a decade. Through satellite readings and geological analysis, they would piece together the fragments, and the story that emerged was one of planetary scale. The eruption had been immense enough to dim the sun for 18 months, cooling the globe by as much as 3 degrees. The Earth's own breath had darkened the heavens. But to the people living then, it was far more personal. The chill seeped into their bones, and their days became rituals of endurance. Farmers watched their fields wither before their eyes, their seeds dying in the ground. Families huddled together for warmth, burning anything they could find, wood, straw, even furniture, to survive the relentless cold. The seas froze farther south than living memory recalled. Birds migrated early and never returned. The air was silent, the nights long, and the stars dim. It felt like being trapped in a dream where the world no longer remembered how to wake. Even animals seemed confused. Herds wandered aimlessly, searching for food that no longer grew. Wolves came down from the mountains, desperate and thin. The cycle of life that had guided humanity since the dawn of civilization had broken. No season could be trusted. No harvest could be predicted. In some places, famine began to whisper its first cruel words, not yet screaming, but slowly tightening its grip. In distant monasteries, scribes wrote that the sun gave no light for a year and a half, and that the fruits did not ripen. The words seemed small, almost calm, but behind them lay hunger, despair, and the slow erosion of hope. Parents told their children stories to comfort them, that the sun was merely sleeping, that it would soon awaken. But even as they spoke, they doubted their own words. And yet, through all of this, life persisted. Though the fields were bare and the skies dim, the human spirit clung to the faint promise of return. Across the world, people prayed, in churches, in temples, in open fields beneath the ghostly sun. They prayed not just for light, but for meaning. And as the haze thickened, as the pale days stretched endlessly into one another, a strange realization began to dawn. Perhaps this was not the work of gods or demons, but of the earth itself, vast, untamable, and alive in ways no man could yet comprehend. This idea, that the earth could act with such power, indifferent to the fate of kings and empires, was too large for their minds to hold. But it would echo across centuries, whispered through myth and legend until science gave it voice. The eruption that veiled the world in shadow was not only a disaster, it was a revelation. It reminded humanity that the ground beneath their feet was not solid, that the world they knew could change in an instant. And so, under that dim, gray sky, civilization trembled. People did not yet know it, but this was only the beginning. The volcanic winter would stretch into years, the famine into decades. The veil would lift, but the scars would remain, in the soil, in the stories, in the bones of those who survived. The world had been shrouded in ash, and though the sun would one day return, it would never shine quite the same again. The seasons began to unravel. The steady rhythm that had guided humanity for millennia faltered, replaced by chaos and confusion. In the year after the sky dimmed, the world lost its sense of time. Summer came and went without warmth. Winter arrived early and refused to leave. The rains fell at strange intervals, cold and heavy, as though the sky itself no longer remembered its purpose. The once gentle transitions between seasons, the soft bloom of spring, the golden hum of harvest, were gone. The earth had slipped out of tune, and all life was forced to move to a rhythm it could no longer hear. Across the Byzantine Empire, the consequences were devastating. Fields that had sustained generations now stood empty, their soil hardened by frost even in months once filled with sun. Grain refused to ripen. Olives shriveled on the branch. The marketplaces of Constantinople grew quiet, their usual songs of barter replaced by murmurs of worry. Farmers brought what little they could harvest, their carts half empty and their faces drawn with hunger. The empire, proud and vast, found itself humbled before the cold breath of the earth. In Ireland, the chroniclers wrote with a kind of grim precision, a failure of bread in the year 536. Behind those simple words lay a story of hunger that stretched across continents. The island's once lush fields became barren. Families rationed what little they had, roots, dried fish, scraps of grain, and prayed the next season would bring light. But each new dawn brought the same dim sky, the same cold wind that cut through the heart of summer. Children grew thin, and elders whispered prayers they were not sure anyone could hear. Farther east, in China, the record spoke of snow falling in the height of summer. Crops withered beneath layers of ice. Rivers froze over, trapping fish beneath solid sheets that would not melt for months. The emperor's advisors searched the heavens for explanation, but the stars were lost behind haze. They ordered temples to conduct rituals of renewal, hoping to restore balance. But balance, it seemed, had been broken entirely. The world had entered a state of quiet rebellion. In the Middle East, once green valleys turned to dust. The Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, became brittle and pale. Farmers dug deeper for water, but the wells returned only mud. Livestock grew weak, their ribs visible beneath thinning hides. Traders crossing the deserts described an unnatural stillness, as if even the wind had forgotten its way. The once reliable rhythms of rain and flood, planting and harvest, no longer obeyed the old patterns. Nature had withdrawn its favor. In the north, where winters were already long, the change was merciless. Scandinavian villages faced months without sunlight strong enough to melt the snow. What had once been stories told around the fire, tales of endless winters and gods devoured by wolves, suddenly felt like prophecy. The people looked to the skies and saw the myth made real. They called it Fimbulvetter, the Great Winter, a prelude to Ragnarok. Fear and reverence mixed together in the cold air. Everywhere, the same story unfolded with different words. The sun was weak. The cold was strong. Hunger followed both. In the Mediterranean, the great cities could no longer rely on the countryside to feed them. Grain shipments dwindled, and food prices soared. Bread riots broke out in the streets of Alexandria. In Rome's fading shadow, the people scavenged what they could from the ruins of empire, burning ancient timbers from abandoned villas just to stay warm. The rhythm of life, birth, growth, harvest, rest, had shattered. There was no longer a season to count on. Seeds planted with hope often rotted beneath the cold ground, while those sown late sometimes sprouted too soon and died under frost. Farmers began to lose faith not just in the earth, but in their understanding of it. They had always believed that the soil and sky were bound by law and rhythm, by promises that could be trusted. Now those promises were broken, and humanity stood before an indifferent world. The collapse of the seasons carried not just physical but spiritual weight. Priests preached repentance, declaring that the dimmed sun was punishment for human arrogance. In Byzantine churches, candles burned day and night, their flames trembling in the drafts that swept through marble halls. People knelt on cold stone floors, whispering prayers for forgiveness. Yet in their hearts, doubt began to take root. What if this was not divine will at all, but something greater, something older than gods or men? The sensory world itself began to feel alien. The smell of soil, once rich and full of promise, turned stale and sharp. The air carried the taste of ash. Even sound seemed to dull, as though the dampened atmosphere swallowed it whole. The laughter of children was rare. Conversations grew quieter, more cautious. At night, fires burned low to conserve wood, their smoke clinging thickly to the rafters. Sleep came slowly, heavy with worry. People awoke unsure whether they had dreamt of warmth or remembered it. Still, some tried to adapt. In the valleys of the Alps, people learned to store ice in underground pits to preserve what food they had. In Asia, communities rationed rice and millet with careful precision. In northern villages, hunters pushed deeper into forests, searching for game in lands made dangerous by hunger. There were moments of courage, flashes of human persistence, but even those seemed fragile beneath the weight of endless gray. When the rare clear day arrived, people gathered in silence to watch the weak sun struggle through the haze. For a few fleeting hours, they could feel its touch, not warmth, but a memory of it. They stood with faces tilted upward, eyes half closed, as though trying to drink in light before it disappeared again. Then the haze would return, and the world would fade back into shadow. The collapse of the seasons was more than a change in weather. It was the unraveling of the world's rhythm, a quiet dismantling of order. Nature, once predictable and kind, had become a stranger. The people of 536 AD did not yet know that the skies would remain veiled for years, that the famine was only the beginning. But they felt it in their hearts. The balance of the world had broken, and the earth was moving through a darkness it had never known before. In the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the dimmed sun cast long shadows across marble streets that once glowed with golden light. The empire, proud and vast, stood as the last great heir of Rome, its walls strong, its armies disciplined, its churches adorned with splendor. But even the might of Constantinople could not hold back the invisible hand that had seized the world. The fields surrounding the city, once green with barley and wheat, had turned gray and barren. The granaries, once overflowing, now echoed with emptiness. Hunger crept through the alleys and into the palaces. The empire's lifeblood, trade, agriculture, faith, all began to thin beneath the weight of the endless haze. Merchants who sailed the Aegean returned with strange reports. The sea itself seemed colder, its color muted. Fish were scarce, and storms struck without pattern, tearing sails and scattering fleets. In Egypt, the fertile delta of the Nile, the empire's breadbasket, yielded only a fraction of its usual harvest. The canals dried earlier than expected, and the land cracked open like a wound. With famine came unrest. Riots broke out in marketplaces as food grew scarce, and soldiers were sent not to defend borders, but to guard bakeries. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian watched his empire bend under the strain. The ruler who once dreamed of restoring Rome's lost glory now faced an enemy without face or form. His treasuries drained as he imported grain from distant provinces, only to find that other lands too were starving. The roads that connected his empire became corridors of despair, caravans carrying refugees instead of riches, prayers instead of proclamations. The empire, bound by faith and ambition, began to fracture under the pressure of simple, relentless need. Beyond the Byzantine walls, other powers fared no better. To the east, the Sasanian Empire, rivals and mirrors of Byzantium, endured the same hunger, the same cold. Their mighty cities, built upon centuries of wealth and conquest, suddenly found themselves powerless before the gray sky. Fields along the Tigris withered, and cattle fell dead in the mud. The royal priests burned incense to please the gods, but even the sacred fires flickered weakly. The empire's armies, once fierce and disciplined, began to falter as famine stole their strength. The great kings of Persia, who had once threatened Constantinople itself, now turned inward, struggling to feed their own people. In Europe, the remnants of the Western Roman world slipped deeper into ruin. The kingdoms that rose from Rome's ashes, Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Hispania, Franks in Gaul, all felt the shadow of 536. Harvests failed, and what little food could be gathered went to feed armies instead of families. The poor scavenged in forests, stripping bark from trees and grinding it into bitter flour. In monasteries, monks prayed for divine mercy while rationing their own meager bread. The dream of empire, already fading, was snuffed out further by hunger. Even in distant Britannia, far from the centers of power, the calamity reached. Chroniclers spoke of a failure of bread, and of years when the sun gave no warmth. The island, already fractured by war and isolation, descended further into hardship. Trade dwindled. Villages vanished. The memory of Roman roads and shining cities gave way to silence and ruin. The darkness did not only swallow the skies, it consumed history itself. As famine spread, so too did fear. The people turned against their rulers, suspecting them of angering the gods or hiding secret stores of food. In some cities, mobs stormed granaries, believing the empire's officials had hoarded grain for themselves. The streets of Constantinople, once filled with traders from across the known world, became battlegrounds of desperation. Bread was worth more than gold. Mothers offered jewels for a handful of grain. The empire that had built its greatness on order and faith now trembled beneath the weight of chaos. Justinian's government, desperate to maintain control, turned to faith for unity. The great churches were filled day and night with prayers, incense, and lamentations. Hymns echoed across the city, a mixture of hope and despair. But even faith began to waver. Some whispered that the emperor himself had lost the favor of heaven. Others said the end of the world had come. The concept of empire, of divine order, felt fragile beneath the pale sun. Meanwhile, far beyond imperial borders, the steppe tribes to the north and east also suffered. The Huns, Slavs, and Avars, peoples who had once thrived by following herds and trading along rivers, faced starvation as the cold decimated grazing lands. Horses died by the thousands. Nomads, driven by hunger, began to move southward in search of food and warmth, pressing upon the weakened borders of the empires. What began as a natural disaster was quietly becoming a political one. The interconnected world of the 6th century, bound by trade routes, migration, and empire, meant that one region's suffering rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Every city, every village, every kingdom was a thread in the same fragile web, and now that web began to tear. In distant ports, ships sat idle, their crews too weak to sail. In the bustling markets of Antioch and Alexandria, once centers of luxury, the stalls stood empty. Even the rich found little comfort, for gold could not summon a harvest. The weight of the dimmed world pressed down not just on bodies, but on hearts. Poets fell silent. Artists painted less, their colors dulled by scarcity and despair. The empire's scholars, who had once debated philosophy and law, now turned their attention to the practical matters of survival. Libraries grew cold and quiet as hunger emptied the minds of those who once filled them with words. Civilization itself felt brittle, like glass under strain. By the 3rd year of darkness, the Byzantine Empire's borders were more fragile than ever. Rebellions broke out in distant provinces. Armies starved. Trade routes closed. The promise of order that had defined Justinian's reign began to fracture. The emperor, still determined to rebuild the Roman dream, watched his ambitions dissolve beneath gray skies. In the chronicles of his time, we find few grand declarations, few triumphant victories, only accounts of famine, cold, and quiet despair. In the stillness of those years, a haunting truth emerged. The power of empires meant nothing when the earth itself turned against them. The proud banners, the marble palaces, the golden icons, all dimmed beneath the same ashen sun. The Byzantine world, along with its neighbors, stood humbled before forces it could neither predict nor control. And so, beneath the veiled sky of 536 AD, humanity learned once more what it had always known but often forgotten, that no throne, no kingdom, no empire can command the rhythm of the earth. The world had grown cold, and the powers of men bowed before it. Across the vast lands of the north, where forests met frozen plains, the cold became a silent executioner. Crops failed not just once, but year after year. What had begun as an unusually dim season grew into a pattern of ruin. Entire villages in Scandinavia and northern Europe vanished as famine hollowed them out. The sky hung low and gray, and the people, once fierce and resilient, were brought to their knees by an invisible enemy that came not with swords, but with silence. The fjords froze earlier than memory could recall. The rivers turned to ice, trapping boats that once carried goods between settlements. Hunters found less game in the woods, and the few animals that remained were thin, sickly, and desperate themselves. In the Norse lands, oral traditions later whispered of a long winter before Ragnarok, the end of the world. Some scholars would come to believe that these tales were born from memories of this very time. The people called it Fimbulwinter, the great winter that never seemed to end. Across the villages of what would one day become Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, families huddled in longhouses, burning what little wood they had left. The smoke hung thick in the air, the fires dim and weak. Many believed that the gods had abandoned them. Others thought that this was the punishment of giants, come to swallow the sun. As months became years, migration began. Families abandoned their ancestral lands, traveling southward in search of food and warmth. These migrations, driven by necessity, would later shape the map of Europe itself. Tribes collided and merged, and in the chaos of movement, new cultures were born while old ones disappeared forever. The darkness had set a great human tide in motion, a tide that neither kings nor emperors could stop. The boundaries of the known world began to blur, as people moved like shadows across a gray and dying landscape. Further west, in the islands of Ireland and Britain, monks recorded strange signs. Chronicles tell of a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Their writings carry a quiet terror, of summers that felt like winter, of frost clinging to fields in months when flowers should have bloomed. Villages emptied, their people lost to hunger or wandering. Trade faltered as ships refused to sail the restless seas. The world seemed to be folding inward, and for those who lived through it, it must have felt like the unraveling of creation itself. In Gaul, the heart of what would later become France, bishops urged their flocks to fast and pray. Bells tolled for hours each day, their echoes rolling through empty streets. Markets once filled with chatter were silent, save for the creaking of wooden stalls. The great rivers of Europe, the Rhine, the Danube, ran sluggish and cold. Fish disappeared, and the water turned cloudy and still. Those who survived spoke of nights so long that people lost track of time, days when the sun rose only as a faint, orange smear behind a curtain of haze. The Slavs and Avars to the east suffered much the same. Pastures withered. The herds, which had long sustained entire tribes, perished in droves. Those who could fled toward the south, raiding or begging for sustenance as they went. Across the steppe, the sound of hooves no longer meant war, but desperation. The ancient balance of the Eurasian plains was broken. And where once there had been open trade and movement, now there was only migration and fear. In the high mountains of the Alps, travelers and shepherds were trapped by snow that came months early and lingered long past spring. Ancient passes, lifelines between cultures, became walls of ice. Traders vanished, their caravans found years later encased in frozen drifts. Local legends grew around them, of ghostly processions wandering the mountains, of spirits that guarded the dead who never reached their destination. Even nature itself seemed haunted, as though the world were holding its breath. Across the Mediterranean, the sea that had once connected civilizations began to isolate them instead. Ships left harbor less often, and those that did spoke of strange fogs that hung over the waters. Sailors would steer by stars that no longer shone as bright. The wind carried a chill that bit through even the thickest sailcloth. Ports that had thrived for centuries, Naples, Carthage, Alexandria, grew quiet. Warehouses emptied, and the sound of hammers and voices faded. Civilization, for a time, contracted like a dying flame. And yet, amid the cold and ruin, there were whispers of resilience. Some communities found ways to endure. They adapted their crops, traded what little they had, and relied on faith to fill the spaces left by hunger. In remote monasteries, monks tended small gardens under makeshift shelters, preserving seeds for future seasons that might never come. These were acts of quiet defiance, sparks of human endurance flickering in the great shadow of disaster. But there was no denying that the balance of the old world had been broken. Every society, from the mighty empire to the humblest tribe, was reshaped by the same invisible hand. The patterns of migration, the shifts of power, the mingling of peoples, these were all born of the cold years. The catastrophe of 536 AD was not merely an event, it was a turning point in human history. Out of it would come new kingdoms, new faiths, new myths. The old world had ended not with war or fire, but with the dimming of the sun. By the close of that decade, when the light finally began to return, the survivors were no longer the same people who had seen it vanish. They carried with them stories of endurance and loss, of faith and fear. They had seen the sun fail, and yet they had lived. The northern world, scarred and changed, stood at the edge of a new era, one born not of conquest, but of survival. And though the earth would heal, the memory of those dark years would remain, carried in legend, in scripture, and in the bones of those who endured it. Far to the east, beyond the deserts and the mountains, another world was suffering in silence. The lands of Asia, vast and varied, were not spared from the shadow that had swallowed the sun. From the great cities of China to the steppes of Mongolia, the dim sky stretched endlessly, turning the familiar rhythm of seasons into a cycle of confusion and loss. In the great empire of Northern Wei, already weakened by division and political decay, the darkness deepened its fall. The emperor's court, once brilliant with silk and ceremony, now sat beneath a sky of pale gray. Messengers brought grim news from the countryside, rivers that failed to flood, harvests that rotted before they ripened, and villages where entire families had vanished. Ancient Chinese chronicles, precise and meticulous, record that in the year 536, yellow dust rained like snow, and the sun lost its light. The people believed that heaven had withdrawn its favor. In a culture built upon the harmony between heaven and earth, such signs were more than omens, they were judgments. Farmers knelt in their barren fields and prayed to unseen gods. Scholars wrote desperate poems to the sky, wondering if humanity had broken the balance of nature. In Luoyang, once the beating heart of the empire, markets shrank to shadows of their former selves. Grain became so rare that the price of a handful could buy a horse. Beggars lined the city gates, their voices hoarse from hunger. The northern steppes fared even worse. The Turkic and Mongolic tribes who depended on their herds saw those herds perish one by one. Grasslands turned brown under the ash-gray skies, and what little vegetation grew was coarse and sparse. Horses, the lifeblood of their nomadic culture, grew weak and died in droves. With each passing month, the steppe people found themselves forced to move south, pressing into China's borders. Refugees and raiders alike spilled across the frontiers, desperate for food. The Chinese generals, weakened by internal strife, could do little to hold them back. What began as a natural disaster began to unravel the political order of an entire continent. In the south, where the lands were warmer, famine still took hold, though its grip was slower. The rice paddies of the Yangtze Basin, the pride of southern China, suffered under erratic rains and sudden frost. The delicate rhythm of planting and harvest was broken, and with it, the stability of countless lives. Families who had farmed the same land for generations abandoned their homes and fled toward cities in hope of relief. But the cities had nothing to give. The local governors, already strained by taxation and unrest, could not feed the swelling crowds. Roads filled with the sick and starving. Disease followed famine, spreading in the wake of desperation. The empire trembled, not from invasion, but from the slow, unrelenting pressure of hunger. Further west, across the great mountain passes, the lands of Central Asia echoed the same despair. Caravan routes along the Silk Road, once alive with traders carrying silk, spices, and knowledge, fell silent. The sand dunes of the Taklamakan and the high plateaus of Tibet saw fewer travelers. The once thriving oasis towns that had connected east and west began to wither. Wells dried up, and the wind carried only dust. Merchants who dared to travel spoke of a dead sky and of nights so cold that camels froze standing. In the quiet that followed, the great arteries of trade that linked empires slowed almost to a stop. The lifeblood of civilization itself was draining away. Even further south, in the kingdoms of India, The dim sun brought confusion to a land accustomed to abundance. The monsoon rains faltered, arriving late or not at all. Rivers that had flowed steadily for millennia shrank to narrow streams. The Ganges basin, a cradle of faith and civilization, faced drought and famine. Temples filled with prayers to Vishnu and Shiva, to gods of creation and preservation, but the heavens remained silent. Chronicles tell of wandering ascetics who saw in the darkened world a divine warning, a reminder of impermanence. Kings and peasants alike were humbled before forces beyond comprehension. In the highlands of Nepal, small mountain communities endured as best they could, living on stores of grain and the thin yield of cold-resistant crops. Yet even there, where survival had always been a test of endurance, the gray skies brought unease. The Himalayas loomed like watchful giants under a dim and foreign light. The people whispered of a curse from the gods, of spirits that had grown weary of humankind's greed. The stillness in the mountain air felt heavy, unnatural, as if time itself had slowed. Across Asia, stories began to form, myths and legends that tried to make sense of what reason could not explain. In China, poets spoke of a dragon that had swallowed the sun. In India, seers saw visions of a cosmic imbalance, a war among celestial beings that had dimmed the heavens. In the steppes, warriors told tales of the sky god turning his face away from humankind. These stories, born from suffering, would live long after the famine passed. They became part of the shared human attempt to understand disaster, to give shape to fear through words. And yet, beneath the despair, there was something else, something quietly defiant. In villages and temples, in yurts and mountain caves, people still lit fires. They shared what little they had. They told stories not only of loss, but of endurance. The chroniclers who recorded those years did not just capture pain, they captured survival. In the faint light of their candles, they wrote of neighbors who helped each other, of strangers who shared their last handful of grain, of faith that did not break even when the sun did. Slowly, imperceptibly, the world began to change. Populations shifted. Kingdoms collapsed and others arose in their place. New paths were forged, both physical and cultural. The Silk Road, once broken by famine, would one day reawaken stronger than before. In the ashes of despair, a new chapter of human movement began, one that would spread not only goods, but ideas, languages, and beliefs. By the end of the decade, the skies began to clear over Asia. The faint warmth of the sun returned, but the memory of the darkness remained. The world that emerged from those gray years was not the same one that had entered them. People had seen the fragility of all things, empires, crops, and even faith. Yet they had also discovered something enduring, that even under the dimmest light, humanity continues to move forward. The lands of Asia, like the rest of the world, had been tested by silence, and from that silence, new stories were born. Across the Mediterranean, the lands that had long basked in warmth and abundance now shivered beneath the shadow of the dimmed sun. Italy, once the beating heart of the old Roman world, had already endured centuries of upheaval, but nothing had prepared it for the quiet, creeping devastation of 536 AD. Olive groves drooped under frost, their fruit withered before it could be pressed into oil. Vineyards, symbols of prosperity and celebration, yielded grapes that were small, sour, and shriveled. Fields that had once produced enough grain to feed cities now yielded nothing. The soil, cracked and parched despite rain, seemed to have turned against those who had long depended on its generosity. In Rome, the city itself felt hollowed out by the famine. The Forum, where senators once debated and merchants traded, echoed with an eerie stillness. The streets were quieter than they had been in decades, as the poor scavenged what little food remained, and the wealthy withdrew behind walls and gates, hoarding stores meant to last a season. The city, a jewel of history and ambition, seemed to mourn beneath the gray light. Citizens whispered of curses and omens, speaking in hushed tones about a world that had grown cold and indifferent. The grandeur of Rome, its temples and forums, could not shield its people from the basic law of life. Without food, civilization falters. Further south, in Carthage and Alexandria, the Mediterranean's great ports faced their own trials. Ships arrived from distant lands carrying fewer goods than usual, and some never returned at all. The sea, once a conduit for commerce and communication, seemed to turn capricious. Storms struck without warning, while calm seas masked dangers beneath the waves. Fishermen spoke of strange fogs that clung to the water, making navigation treacherous. The markets emptied as grain and fish grew scarce, and the cries of the hungry filled the streets. Even merchants accustomed to hardship found themselves powerless against a world grown strange and gray. The harvests failed repeatedly across the region. Farmers watched with despair as wheat and barley languished under cold rains and unseasonable frost. Vineyards that had promised a season of wine yielded bitter, meager fruit. Families rationed every morsel, burning leaves and straw to supplement what little wood they had for cooking and warmth. The famine did not discriminate. Noble or peasant, city dweller or farmer, all felt its slow, unrelenting grip. In the open-air markets of the Mediterranean, food became currency, and hunger was the great equalizer. In Byzantium, the empire's capital on the Bosporus, the consequences of famine and environmental collapse were magnified by political tension. The Emperor Justinian, already burdened by campaigns to reclaim lost territories, now faced a population weakened by malnutrition. Soldiers grew thin and tired, unable to march or fight as they once had. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces, not from ambition, but from desperation. Food riots erupted in city streets. Citizens, driven by hunger, sometimes attacked the very warehouses meant to protect the empire's stores. The delicate fabric of society frayed under the pressure of scarcity, revealing the vulnerability even of the most powerful human institutions. The psychological toll of famine was profound. In homes across the Mediterranean, families huddled together for warmth and sustenance. Children grew pale and thin, their laughter muted by uncertainty. Parents whispered prayers into the fading light, clinging to faith when the sun could not provide reassurance. Monks and priests lit candles that flickered against the shadows, performing rituals meant to coax favor from gods who had become distant and silent. Hope itself became a fragile flame, threatened by despair but stubbornly refusing to extinguish. Trade networks, the lifelines of Mediterranean civilization, faltered as famine and fear spread. Merchants hesitated to travel, and caravans moved slowly, burdened by uncertainty and the threat of theft or rebellion. The flow of goods, which had sustained culture and wealth for centuries, slowed to a trickle. Cities that depended on imports of grain, olive oil, and wine faced starvation if the supply did not arrive. And when it did, it was often insufficient to meet the demands of the desperate populations. The interconnected world, once a source of prosperity, had become a chain linking all to shared vulnerability. Even the climate itself seemed unrecognizable. The skies were a persistent gray, sometimes veiled in thick yellow dust that dimmed the sun for weeks at a time. Rain fell at unpredictable intervals, sometimes heavy and sudden, sometimes absent for weeks, leaving the land dry and cracked. The Mediterranean's normally gentle breezes carried an unnatural chill, seeping into homes, courts, and marketplaces alike. People spoke of the sky's anger, of divine punishment, of forces beyond comprehension. In this theater of environmental despair, nature played the leading role, and humanity was forced into an uneasy supporting part. Yet even in the midst of devastation, human resilience persisted. Families devised new ways to survive, cultivating less favorable soils, storing grain with greater care, and sharing limited resources with neighbors. Religious communities, though strained, offered shelter and aid, keeping alive the faintest threads of society. Stories of compassion and courage, though often lost to time, flickered quietly in the shadows of famine. These acts of endurance would ripple into the future, shaping culture, belief, and human memory of survival. By the end of the third year under the dimmed sky, the Mediterranean had been irrevocably changed. Landscapes bore scars of famine and frost. Cities bore the weight of loss, both physical and emotional. The survivors carried stories that would echo through generations, stories of hunger, endurance, and the terrifying fragility of human life beneath the indifferent forces of the earth. And though eventually the sun would regain its light, The memory of those dim years remained, a shadow on the consciousness of a world that had glimpsed its own vulnerability. In the vast stretches of Europe, far beyond the Mediterranean, the darkness continued its quiet conquest. The great forests of the continent, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, fell strangely silent. Animals wandered in confusion, their patterns disrupted by the unfamiliar cold and dim light. Deer came closer to villages in search of food, wolves prowled with bolder hunger, and livestock weakened despite the care of their keepers. Human populations, once confident in their dominion over the land, now felt the vulnerability of their fragile existence. The rhythm of life, planting, growing, harvesting, had been broken, leaving communities scrambling to survive each day without certainty. In Gaul, the fields that had once fed legions and cities now lay fallow. Farmers looked on helplessly as their wheat failed to ripen, their barley rotted in the fields, and their roots shriveled beneath a soil hardened by frost and ash. Villagers rationed what little remained, often giving priority to children and the elderly, yet even these careful measures were insufficient. Hunger whispered through every home, growing into a persistent ache. Markets, once bustling centers of commerce, became ghostly corridors. The merchants' voices that had once echoed across town squares were replaced by quiet desperation, and food, once plentiful, became the rarest of commodities. Beyond the fields, in cities such as Paris and Lyon, the crisis deepened. Grain shipments that had traditionally flowed from the countryside dwindled to nearly nothing. Bakers struggled to feed the population, and bread became precious, a symbol of survival itself. Those who could afford it hoarded supplies, while the poor scavenged in the forests and abandoned structures, hoping for scraps. Disease, hunger, and exposure claimed lives with quiet cruelty, often leaving no records beyond fleeting mentions in chronicles and letters. The urban population, reliant on external supply chains, felt the effects of famine more immediately, as the flow of sustenance stopped almost entirely. The northern kingdoms, too, were not spared. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in what would later become England faced failed harvests and biting winters. Snow fell earlier than ever recorded, lingering into months that should have been warm. Crops froze in the fields, rivers and ponds froze, killing fish and other aquatic life. Villages became isolated, cut off from neighbors by snow and ice. Nomadic groups moved southward in search of food, sometimes encroaching on settled lands and creating conflict born not of ambition, but of desperation. Fear and caution became second nature, as even familiar landscapes felt hostile under the new climate. In the eastern reaches of Europe, Slavic tribes faced the same dire reality. Livestock perished en masse, and pastures withered to gray dust. Communities abandoned their settlements, migrating in search of fertile land or more hospitable climates. These migrations created pressure on bordering regions, sparking disputes and occasional skirmishes as people fought not for power, but simply to survive. The flow of populations reshaped borders and influenced cultural exchange in ways that would ripple across centuries, demonstrating that the catastrophe of 536 AD was as much social as it was environmental. The collapse of seasonal cycles disrupted not only agriculture, but also the spiritual and cultural rhythms of society. Festivals tied to planting and harvest were cancelled or muted, and rituals designed to honor the gods or bless the land seemed powerless under the persistent gray sky. Temples, once vibrant centers of community life, felt empty, their priests struggling to maintain faith in the face of visible evidence of nature's cruelty. Songs of joy and praise became rare, replaced by hymns of desperation and lamentation. The psychological toll was immense, and even those accustomed to hardship felt the weight of despair pressing heavily upon them. Amid this chaos, the great cities of the Frankish kingdoms, centers of political power and culture, faced the strain of famine. Noble estates, which had previously supported thousands through organized agriculture, could no longer guarantee sustenance. Serfs and laborers, desperate for food, sometimes fled to the forests or neighboring lands. Towns along rivers like the Loire and the Seine, dependent on both local harvests and riverine trade, found themselves increasingly isolated. The breakdown of these systems revealed the fragile interconnectedness of medieval society and how quickly civilization could unravel when the earth itself turned against its inhabitants. Even the cultural achievements of the period could not shield communities from the cold and hunger. Manuscripts detailing philosophy, law, and literature were preserved only in the hope that human ingenuity might survive beyond famine. Artisans who once created fine wares found their hands idle, their workshops closed due to the scarcity of materials. Education slowed. Scholarly pursuits were put aside for the immediate demands of survival. Yet even in the face of adversity, humans continued to adapt. They learned to store food more carefully, cultivate less favorable soils, and share resources among extended families and neighbors. Survival became a communal endeavor, knitting together families, villages, and towns in new and often unexpected ways. By the fifth year of hardship, Europe had been irrevocably changed. Landscapes bore the marks of famine and frost, cities bore the weight of scarcity and fear, and the collective memory of people carried the indelible shadow of the dimmed sun. The old rhythms of life, of planting and harvesting, of feasts and festivals, had been fractured. But the human spirit, though tested and worn, endured. Communities adapted, migrated, and survived, laying the foundation for the Europe that would emerge in the centuries to follow. The crisis of 536 AD had stripped the continent bare, yet from that barrenness came resilience, innovation, and a new awareness of the precariousness of life under the ever-changing sky. In the lands of the Middle East, the dimmed sun cast an unusual pall over valleys that had once been renowned for fertility and abundance. The great crescent of civilization, stretching from Mesopotamia through Persia to the Levant, experienced famine and disruption on a scale that shook the foundations of kingdoms. Rivers that had fed civilizations for millennia, like the Tigris, Euphrates, and Jordan, swelled or shrank unpredictably, leaving farmers uncertain whether to plant or wait. Crops rotted in the fields under the weight of frost and ash, while wells ran low, forcing villagers to dig deeper into parched earth for what little water remained. Hunger became the silent ruler of these lands, shaping the lives of everyone, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant. Cities that had long been centers of trade and learning faced isolation. Caravan routes along the deserts became perilous as sandstorms rose with unusual frequency, erasing trails and burying provisions. Traders reported seeing mirages that confused even the most seasoned travelers, and many journeys ended in abandonment or death. Markets that had once thrived under the exchange of spices, textiles, and metals became ghostly spaces. Merchants, once confident in the abundance of their goods, were forced to ration what little they had, and even the wealthiest could not escape the quiet dominion of scarcity. In the heart of Persia, the Sasanian Empire faced similar trials. The fields along the Tigris and Euphrates, which had once produced grain to feed armies and cities, yielded only partial harvests. Pastures turned brittle, and livestock perished. Nomadic tribes pushed southward, driven by hunger, occasionally clashing with settled populations. The government struggled to maintain order, sending soldiers not to wage war, but to protect food stores. The prestige of the court and the authority of kings were weakened not by conquest, but by the unrelenting forces of nature. Religious leaders interpreted the calamity as divine judgment, urging repentance, yet the haze and cold persisted, defying understanding or appeasement. Further west, in the Levant and Egypt, famine brought social unrest and the breakdown of community structures. The Nile, whose annual floods had been relied upon for centuries, behaved erratically, either overflowing with destructive force or shrinking into shallow, parched channels. Grain shipments to the cities faltered. In Alexandria, once a hub of learning and trade, bread became scarce and riots broke out. Citizens, desperate to survive, turned on one another. The wealthiest attempted to secure supplies for their households, but social tensions surged as the imbalance between haves and have-nots became impossible to ignore. The psychological and cultural impact was profound. In towns and villages, people turned to religious and cultural traditions for explanations. Temples and shrines were filled day and night with prayers and offerings. Priests and scholars wrote of omens, strange skies, and cosmic disturbances. Astrology and divination saw renewed importance, as communities sought patterns in the chaos. People wondered if they were witnessing the end of an age, a punishment for past transgressions, or simply the unpredictable wrath of nature itself. The world seemed to shrink under the veil of gray, and even the most learned observers were humbled by forces beyond their comprehension. In rural communities, daily life became a battle against slow starvation. Families rationed grain, boiled roots, and sometimes ate animals that would normally have been livestock for trade or labor. Children grew weaker, and parents faced agonizing choices about whom to feed first. Entire villages reported losses of significant portions of their populations. The climate, while silent, exerted a constant pressure that tested human endurance to the limits. Social bonds were strained, but survival also inspired ingenuity. New techniques of food storage, small-scale irrigation, and barter systems emerged to help communities weather the famine. Even in the courts of kings and emperors, the effects of 536 AD were felt. Officials attempted to maintain authority through distribution of supplies, yet the scale of the crisis often overwhelmed them. Military campaigns were delayed or abandoned, as soldiers could not be sustained without adequate food. Diplomatic relations between kingdoms were strained, with food scarcity intensifying competition for resources. Empires and principalities alike were forced to adapt to a new reality in which human power was dwarfed by the sheer scale of environmental disruption. By the end of the decade, the Middle East had been irrevocably altered. Agricultural patterns shifted, trade networks were disrupted, and populations migrated in search of sustenance. Yet amid the hardship, resilience endured. Communities adapted, governments recalibrated, and cultures evolved in response to these challenges. The famine and dimmed sun of 536 AD had revealed the vulnerability of human society to forces beyond control, but they had also illuminated the capacity for endurance and adaptation, a reminder that even under shadowed skies, life persisted, finding ways to endure and rebuild. Across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean and into the heart of Europe, the years of famine and dimmed sunlight continued to reshape societies in ways both subtle and profound. In Italy, Spain, and the southern regions of Gaul, the social fabric was stretched thin as families struggled to survive. Farmers, once confident in the rhythm of planting and harvest, faced unpredictable seasons that yielded little sustenance. Fields lay barren or destroyed, livestock weakened, and granaries emptied far faster than they could be replenished. Villages relied upon their neighbors for survival, often sharing the last remnants of grain and salted meat, and creating networks of mutual aid that would later form the basis of regional solidarity. Yet even these efforts could not stave off hunger entirely, and mortality quietly rose, leaving some hamlets reduced to mere shadows of their former populations. In the urban centers, the crisis was amplified. Cities like Rome, Carthage, Marseille, and Toledo were dependent on the steady flow of grain from the countryside, yet those shipments had dwindled to near nothing. Markets that had once overflowed with produce, fish, and bread now stood eerily quiet. Families rationed meager supplies with painstaking care, while the wealthy, though still possessing wealth, could not escape the universal hunger. Social tensions grew, and occasional riots erupted as desperation overcame patience. The desperation was not only physical but psychological. The sun remained dim, the days colder than usual, and the uncertainty of survival weighed heavily on the minds of citizens. Northern Europe, where agriculture had always been more marginal, fared even worse. In the lands of the Franks, Saxons, and other Germanic tribes, the famine compounded existing hardships. Forests provided some sustenance in the form of wild game and foraged roots, but the diminished light and unseasonable cold limited growth, and hunting could not fully replace cultivated crops. Communities migrated in search of food, sometimes encountering other groups and creating conflict or alliances in equal measure. These movements altered settlement patterns and would shape the political geography of Europe for generations. The hunger of 536 to 540 AD forced human populations to become more mobile, flexible, and adaptive even under extreme stress. In the British Isles, chroniclers spoke of years without sun and failure of bread, describing a world where the basic cycles of life were thrown into chaos. Crops failed repeatedly, rivers froze, and livestock died in disproportionate numbers. Communities that had once been self-sufficient were pressed to their limits, and even coastal settlements found fishing unreliable due to changing conditions at sea. The social and economic structures of early medieval Britain were tested, leading to local innovations in food storage, communal labor, and resource sharing. Survival became an all-consuming concern, reshaping priorities and customs in ways that would echo into future generations. The psychological effects of prolonged famine extended beyond mere survival. Fear and superstition grew alongside hunger, shaping cultural and religious life. In towns and villages, people interpreted the gray skies and failing crops as signs of divine displeasure. Monks and priests prayed fervently, seeking to restore favor with the gods, while scholars and scribes recorded events with meticulous attention, creating chronicles that would preserve the memory of the crisis for centuries. The collective memory of these events shaped mythology, folklore, and even later religious practices, as humanity attempted to make sense of forces it could not control. Migration and social disruption created unexpected consequences as well. Populations moving south and east in search of food brought new ideas, languages, and cultural practices into regions previously isolated. Formerly stable kingdoms had to contend with influxes of refugees, which strained resources but also contributed to the diffusion of knowledge and customs. These movements laid the groundwork for future political and cultural transformations, demonstrating that catastrophe, while destructive, could also serve as a catalyst for change. Even in the Mediterranean, where climates were typically more forgiving, cities experienced unrest. Bread riots in Alexandria, Carthage, and Antioch were fueled not only by scarcity but by fear and uncertainty. Officials tried to maintain order by distributing grain or offering temporary relief, yet the magnitude of the crisis exceeded administrative capacity. Social hierarchies were challenged, and the distinction between rich and poor became less meaningful in the face of universal hunger. The psychological strain on leaders, merchants, and commoners alike underscored the fragility of human systems when confronted with prolonged environmental stress. By the end of the 5th year, Europe and the Mediterranean had been irrevocably altered. Communities had learned to adapt or perish, migration had reshaped the human landscape, and cultural memory had been indelibly marked by famine and fear. Yet despite the immense suffering, resilience endured. People innovated, shared, and persevered, maintaining the threads of civilization in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of 536 AD was one of both loss and endurance, a stark reminder that humanity, though vulnerable to the forces of nature, possesses an extraordinary capacity to survive, adapt, and rebuild, even under the dimmest skies. Across the northern steppes and into the highlands of Eastern Europe, the relentless shadow of famine and environmental collapse continued to reshape human life. The great rivers, Dnieper, Don, and Volga, that had long supported settlements and trade now ran low or froze unpredictably, disrupting irrigation, transport, and communication. Villages that had thrived along these waterways were left isolated. Winter, which once receded predictably, lingered into the months that should have welcomed spring, leaving crops stunted, pastures barren, and livestock starving. Even forests, normally reliable sources of game and firewood, were affected. Animals were sparse, and trees, weakened by abnormal cold, yielded less wood. Survival became a daily negotiation with the harsh and unforgiving landscape, a struggle that spared neither the commoner nor the chieftain. Nomadic tribes of the steppes faced existential challenges. Their herds, the lifeblood of their economy and mobility, dwindled rapidly. Horses, cattle, and sheep succumbed to malnutrition and disease. These tribes, historically adept at navigating extremes, were forced to migrate farther and faster than ever before, pressing against the borders of established kingdoms and other nomadic groups. Conflicts sometimes erupted over dwindling resources, but equally often, cooperation emerged as necessity compelled alliances for survival. The mobility and adaptability of these peoples allowed them to endure what sedentary societies struggled to survive, and their migrations during these years would leave a lasting imprint on the demographics and cultures of Eastern Europe. Settled communities, meanwhile, struggled to maintain the basic rhythms of life. Fields that had fed generations failed again and again. Villagers rationed seed for planting, often at the cost of immediate nourishment, a desperate gamble to sustain future harvests. Families dug deeper into cellars and storerooms, burning what little would remain for warmth and cooking. Children grew thin, their laughter replaced by quiet endurance. Chroniclers later wrote of homes emptied by famine, of whole families disappearing into forests or rivers, and of communities forced to abandon ancestral lands to survive. Fear became a constant companion, not merely of hunger, but of the unknown trajectory of the seasons, of whether the sun would ever fully return. In the highlands of the Carpathians and the Balkans, the famine's grip was intensified by isolation. Snow lingered long past its season, making travel treacherous and cutting off communication between settlements. People who had relied on trade for grains, salt, and other essentials found themselves increasingly self-reliant. Traditional methods of food preservation, drying, salting, smoking, were employed with urgency, and innovations emerged from necessity. Wild plants were gathered and foraged, and communities relied on collective labor to survive. Despite the hardship, social bonds were reinforced in these regions, as the cooperation required to endure famine strengthened communal identity. The political ramifications of these years were profound. Local leaders who had once governed with authority over stable populations found themselves challenged by unrest, migration, and desperation. Some leaders collapsed under the pressure, replaced by stronger figures able to negotiate the shifting social landscape. Tribes and communities that survived the famine emerged more cohesive, often with redefined hierarchies and social structures. The movements of populations, both voluntary and forced, reshaped territories, trade routes, and alliances across Eastern Europe. These transformations, born from crisis, would influence the political map for generations, demonstrating how environmental catastrophe could accelerate human adaptation and cultural evolution. Even in cultural and spiritual life, the shadow of famine was unmistakable. Temples and churches remained centers for aid and prayer, yet their congregations were diminished by hunger and migration. Religious rituals were intensified, with supplications for sun, rain, and harvests becoming central to daily life. Folktales and legends arose to explain the darkness and cold, speaking of celestial punishment, malevolent spirits, or cosmic imbalance. These stories preserved collective memory, framing the catastrophe in ways that could be transmitted across generations. They were not merely tales of fear, but lessons in endurance and the importance of community, faith, and resilience. By the final years of the famine, Eastern Europe had been irrevocably transformed. Settlement patterns shifted, populations moved, and cultural practices adapted to the harsh new reality. Those who survived carried with them knowledge of survival, adaptation, and cooperation, which would prove crucial in the rebuilding of communities and the re-establishment of trade and agriculture. The catastrophic years of 536 to 540 AD were not only a test of physical endurance, but of social cohesion, ingenuity, and the human capacity to endure environmental extremes. Though the sun gradually returned to its former brilliance, the lessons of these years remained indelibly imprinted on the landscape and the collective memory of the peoples of Eastern Europe. Across the distant lands of the Arctic and subarctic regions, the chilling shadow of 536 AD reached even the edges of human habitation where survival had always been a delicate balance. In Scandinavia, Iceland, and northern Russia, the long nights became longer still, and the sun struggled to pierce the heavy haze that hung over the land. Snow fell early, rivers froze months before their usual time, and the short growing season for barley, oats, and hardy vegetables was further reduced. Hunters found game increasingly scarce, and the few animals that remained were gaunt, moving cautiously through frost-hardened forests. Even the seas, lifelines for fishing communities, seemed uncooperative. Thick ice formed earlier and lingered longer, making travel and subsistence fishing treacherous. Life in these northern regions had always demanded resilience, But the events of 536 AD tested the limits of endurance in ways unprecedented. Communities that had relied on centuries of knowledge about seasonal patterns were thrown into disarray. Longhouses, which had sheltered generations, now felt insufficient against the bitter cold and persistent gloom. Families rationed dried fish, stored grains, and preserved meat with meticulous care, often eating only the bare minimum to survive. Children, despite the care of their parents, grew pale and frail. Elders whispered stories of winters that lasted a lifetime, drawing parallels between this catastrophe and mythic events described in sagas, as if trying to make sense of an incomprehensible reality through legend. The oral traditions of the North became a vital means of preserving not just memory, but guidance for survival in an altered world. Migration intensified as some families abandoned ancestral homelands in search of more hospitable terrain. Tribes moved southward, seeking trade or fertile land, sometimes clashing with other groups already pressed by famine. These migrations reshaped the human geography of northern Europe, redistributing populations and blending cultures in unforeseen ways. New alliances were formed in the crucible of necessity, and old rivalries were suspended, if only temporarily, by the universal struggle to survive. Every journey was fraught with danger, yet each also carried the potential for resilience, innovation, and adaptation. The psychological impact of extended darkness and famine was profound. The constant gray sky, the bitter cold, and the scarcity of food created a pervasive sense of unease. People interpreted these hardships in spiritual and mythological terms, believing that the gods or supernatural forces were testing humanity. Rituals intensified, often involving offerings to appease deities associated with sun, fertility, and the natural world. Shamans, seers, and priests gained renewed prominence as communities sought guidance and reassurance in the face of a world that seemed to defy comprehension. Legends of giants, frost monsters, and celestial battles were recounted not just as entertainment, but as explanations for the harsh reality, a bridge between the known and the unknowable. Despite these challenges, human resilience remained evident. Communities shared resources, preserved seeds for future planting, and taught younger generations skills vital for survival, from hunting and fishing to the construction of shelters resistant to extreme cold. Knowledge accumulated during these years of adversity became a foundation for adaptation in the centuries that followed. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on social cohesion, cooperation, and the ability to innovate in the face of environmental constraints. Even as conditions gradually improved toward the end of the decade, the northern regions were forever changed. Population shifts had redistributed communities, altering settlement patterns and social structures. Cultural memory preserved the lessons of the famine, forming the basis of enduring oral traditions, moral lessons, and epic sagas. People had witnessed the fragility of life in the extreme north, yet had discovered an inner strength and ingenuity that allowed them to endure, adapt, and rebuild. The catastrophe of 536 AD left an indelible mark on both the land and its inhabitants, a testament to human resilience under the harshest and most unforgiving conditions. By the close of these years, the Arctic and subarctic peoples had endured one of the most challenging periods in their history. Though the sun gradually regained its strength and the land slowly returned to seasonal normalcy, the memory of prolonged darkness, scarcity, and struggle remained deeply etched into collective consciousness. In those long, gray years, humanity was reminded of its vulnerability, yet also of its extraordinary capacity to survive, to adapt, and to pass down knowledge essential for enduring generations to come. Even as the famine and darkness of 536 AD reached its peak, the ripples of catastrophe extended into every corner of the known world, leaving no land untouched and no people unaffected. In the vast lands of the Indian subcontinent, where fertile plains had long fed empires and civilizations, the monsoon failed with a cruelty that astonished even the oldest farmers. Rivers that had sustained crops for centuries, like the Ganges and Yamuna, ran low or vanished in stretches, leaving rice paddies dry and cracked. Seeds planted with hope shriveled in the sunless haze, and harvested crops often rotted before they could be stored. Villagers relied on stored grain and foraged foods, But even these reserves were limited and quickly exhausted. Hunger became an invisible master, guiding every decision from what to plant, what to eat, and how to ration food among family members. Parents watched their children with anxious eyes, knowing that even small mistakes could lead to irreversible loss. In the kingdoms of northern India, famine fueled unrest and displacement. Families abandoned ancestral villages in search of water and food, creating waves of migration toward the south and east. Entire communities uprooted themselves, traveling long distances with few possessions, relying on rivers, paths, and knowledge of terrain to navigate unfamiliar lands. Conflicts sometimes erupted with established settlements, as the desperate competed for dwindling resources. Yet in other cases, compassion prevailed, and strangers offered shelter, food, or guidance. These migrations, while born of desperation, also contributed to the exchange of cultural practices, languages, and traditions, leaving a legacy that would endure for generations. The psychological weight of famine and dimmed sunlight permeated every level of society. In the palaces of kings, ministers and advisors grappled with the limits of power. Political authority, once maintained through armies and tribute, was now undermined by forces beyond human control. Soldiers, weakened by hunger, could not march, workers could not labor effectively, taxation yielded less than ever. Courts sought to maintain order by distributing relief, yet the scale of suffering was such that efforts were often insufficient. In rural areas, the struggle was no less severe. Villagers developed intricate methods of rationing, using everything from grains and pulses to leaves, roots, and the occasional small animal to survive. Communities organized mutual aid networks, sharing meager supplies and collectively tending fields to ensure that as many people as possible survived until the next harvest. Even the sacred and cultural life of the subcontinent reflected the pervasive anxiety of this era. Temples, shrines, and holy sites became centers for both spiritual solace and practical support. Religious leaders guided communities in offerings, rituals, and prayers, seeking to appease the gods and coax life-giving rains from the skies. Legends arose to explain the prolonged darkness and crop failures, stories that depicted the wrath or displeasure of divine forces, cosmic trials, and the consequences of human hubris. These stories were passed down orally and eventually in written form, becoming integral to cultural memory and providing frameworks for understanding and enduring hardship. Scholars, poets, and chroniclers meticulously recorded these events, ensuring that future generations would remember both the suffering and the resilience of those who endured it. In the southern kingdoms, including those in the Deccan and along the coasts, communities adapted to scarcity with ingenuity. Farmers experimented with planting resilient crops, rotating fields differently, and harvesting earlier to avoid spoilage. Fishing communities, particularly along the western and eastern coasts, struggled as unusual climatic conditions affected fish populations, yet they adjusted their techniques, venturing further into the sea or relying on smaller inshore catches. Trade, which had long sustained cities, slowed as caravans and ships faced unpredictable weather and insecurity along routes. Merchants who once traveled with certainty now navigated hazards, risking not only loss of goods but their own lives. Economic life was disrupted, yet survival inspired innovation, collaboration, and strategic thinking, laying groundwork for the subcontinent's ability to endure future challenges. The famine also had profound effects on population health and demography. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving communities vulnerable to disease. Epidemics spread more easily among populations already strained by lack of food. Mortality rose, leaving gaps in families, communities, and labor forces. Despite these challenges, humans adapted. Techniques for preserving food improved, diets diversified with foraged plants and less conventional protein sources, and knowledge of natural signs, such as soil conditions, water levels, and animal behavior, became crucial for survival. Elders and experienced farmers became invaluable repositories of knowledge, guiding younger generations through a landscape altered by climate and famine. Social structures, too, shifted under the pressures of environmental stress. Villages relied more heavily on collective labor, pooling resources and energy to tend to fields and distribute food equitably. Hierarchies were tested, with leadership increasingly determined by the ability to manage scarcity and maintain cohesion rather than inherited privilege. Community decisions, once guided by tradition alone, now required pragmatism, negotiation, and foresight. Rituals, festivals, and cultural practices adapted to the reality of famine, incorporating acts of shared labor, mutual aid, and religious devotion to strengthen bonds and provide a sense of purpose amid adversity. In the urban centers of India, where trade, administration, and culture intersected, the famine's impact was keenly felt. Cities depended on a steady influx of grain from rural areas, yet that supply faltered. Markets that had once thrived now struggled to maintain basic provisions, and the price of food skyrocketed, leaving the poor and vulnerable in a constant state of crisis. Urban elites, though wealthier, could not fully insulate themselves from scarcity. Public works, cultural events, and education slowed or halted as human and material resources were diverted to basic survival. Even in these cities, human ingenuity shone. Temporary relief networks were organized, public granaries carefully monitored, and systems of rationing and communal support were implemented to maintain stability and prevent total collapse. As years passed and the climate slowly stabilized, communities began the arduous process of recovery. Fields were replanted, herds replenished, and rivers cautiously relied upon once again. Populations adjusted to new patterns of rainfall, temperature, and seasonal variability, incorporating lessons learned during the darkest years. Oral histories, chronicles, and religious texts preserved memories of the famine, ensuring that the events of 536 to 540 AD were not forgotten. The trauma of famine left its mark, but it also fostered resilience, innovation, and a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of environment, society, and survival. By the end of the decade, the Indian subcontinent had endured one of the most severe environmental crises in its recorded history. The famine and dimmed sunlight left scars on the land, altered settlement patterns, reshaped social hierarchies, and influenced cultural memory for generations. Yet despite the immense suffering, human adaptability and perseverance prevailed. Communities rebuilt, trade resumed, and agriculture recovered, but with new insights and practices informed by the lessons of survival. The legacy of 536 AD in India was a testament to the strength of human resilience, the capacity to endure, adapt, and thrive even in the face of nature's most formidable challenges. Across the subcontinent, the famine also prompted philosophical reflection. Scholars, poets, and religious thinkers pondered the fragility of human life and the unpredictability of the natural world. Questions about divine favor, cosmic balance, and the limits of human understanding became central to discourse. These reflections, recorded in manuscripts and preserved orally, informed future generations about the importance of preparedness, humility, and cooperation. In villages and cities alike, the collective experience of famine reinforced a sense of shared humanity and mutual responsibility, shaping cultural norms, ethical practices, and community cohesion in ways that would endure long after the skies cleared. In every corner of the Indian subcontinent, from the Himalayas to the Deccan Plateau, from the river valleys to the coastal regions, the events of 536 to 540 AD left an indelible mark. Human society was tested to its limits, yet, remarkably, it endured. The knowledge gained, the adaptations developed, and the stories told became part of the cultural and historical foundation for generations to come. The famine was not merely a period of suffering, it was a crucible in which human resilience, ingenuity, and cooperation were forged. It demonstrated, with stark clarity, that even under the shadow of environmental catastrophe, life persists, adapts, and ultimately finds a way forward. Even as the sun slowly reclaimed its brilliance and warmth across the lands that had suffered so profoundly, the world of the late 6th century was forever changed. The catastrophe that had begun in 536 AD, often referred to by later chroniclers as the year without sun, had left its mark on every corner of the known world. Societies, economies, and cultures had been tested to their limits, and the scars of famine, migration, and despair lingered even as the environment gradually returned to relative normalcy. People emerged from the crisis weary but wiser, carrying with them hard-earned lessons about the delicate balance between humanity and the natural world. These years had demonstrated that survival depended not solely on strength or wealth, but on foresight, cooperation, and adaptability. Across Europe, the physical and social landscapes bore visible signs of the ordeal. Fields that had been stripped bare were slowly restored through careful cultivation and careful seed preservation. Farmers who had witnessed repeated crop failures learned to diversify their planting, alternating grains and hardy vegetables with orchards and legumes, reducing the risk of total crop loss in a future unpredictable climate. Techniques for soil preservation, irrigation, and storage were refined, ensuring that communities could withstand environmental shocks more effectively. Villages that had nearly vanished were rebuilt, sometimes in new locations that offered better protection against frost and flooding. Families reunited with lost kin, and social bonds that had been frayed by famine were reforged through collective labor and shared recovery. The cities, which had endured not only famine but also social unrest, began to thrive again, though the memory of hunger lingered in every marketplace and granary. Merchants resumed trade cautiously at first, mindful of both human need and the unpredictability of the environment. Ports that had once been silent now hummed with activity, with ships carrying grain, olive oil, textiles, and wine to markets that had suffered deprivation for years. Markets in Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, and Constantinople once again teemed with the sounds of bargaining, the aroma of bread baking, and the bustle of daily commerce. However, the wealthier citizens, having witnessed the fragility of abundance, often retained surpluses for emergencies, and city planners began considering strategies to better stockpile essential supplies. The famine had impressed upon all a sobering truth: civilization could flourish only when careful planning and collective responsibility worked in tandem. In the far north, the lessons of survival were equally profound. Communities in Scandinavia, Iceland, and northern Russia, long accustomed to harsh winters, had endured environmental stress beyond anything previously experienced. During the years of darkness and famine, northern populations had relied heavily on stored provisions, hunting, and foraging, and these strategies had become essential knowledge for future generations. Elders recounted stories of extreme cold, scarcity, and communal ingenuity in sagas and oral histories, teaching children not only survival skills but also the moral imperatives of cooperation, resource sharing, and social cohesion. The movement of populations southward during the famine had reshaped the demographic map, introducing new ideas, customs, and alliances that enriched northern cultures. By the time the sun returned to its full strength, these communities had integrated lessons of endurance, migration, and adaptation into the foundation of their societies. In the Middle East, societies also rebuilt and adapted with remarkable ingenuity. The Tigris and Euphrates valleys, which had suffered from disrupted irrigation and repeated crop failures, saw a resurgence of agricultural experimentation. Farmers restructured canals, improved water storage systems, and experimented with crop rotation in ways that reduced vulnerability to extreme weather. Cities like Baghdad and Damascus, though later to rise in prominence, were influenced by the precedents set during these challenging years. Communities learned to balance reliance on local production with trade, ensuring that food shortages could be mitigated by regional networks. Religious and cultural institutions, which had provided crucial support during the famine, continued to play central roles in organizing relief and fostering community resilience, reinforcing the idea that survival required both practical measures and moral guidance. The psychological and cultural impact of the catastrophe also left lasting impressions. The prolonged famine and dimmed sunlight had generated widespread fear and uncertainty, but these hardships also strengthened cultural memory and identity. Chroniclers, monks, and storytellers recorded the events meticulously, creating narratives that blended factual observation with moral and spiritual reflection. In Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, legends arose of the dim sun, the bitter cold, and the famine that spared no one, regardless of rank or wealth. These stories served not only as historical records but also as moral and practical lessons, a warning of humanity's vulnerability, a guide for survival, and a testament to the enduring strength of communal cooperation. Rituals, Prayers and ceremonies that had been intensified during the crisis persisted even after the sun returned, reinforcing social bonds and reminding communities of the precariousness of life in the face of nature's immense power. Migration patterns shaped by famine continued to influence the human landscape for decades. Populations displaced from northern and eastern Europe settled in more temperate regions, often blending cultures, languages, and traditions. These movements facilitated trade, knowledge exchange, and cultural synthesis. Even where conflict arose over resources, long-term settlements frequently emerged from the initial competition, creating new communities enriched by diverse experiences. In the British Isles, the arrival of displaced groups contributed to the linguistic and cultural mosaic that would later characterize the region.